Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first in a new series of webinars from Live Green, sustainability sort of arm of Live, the umbrella organisation that represents the live music industry. My name is Greg Palmley. I'm the CEO of Live, and I just really want to sort of welcome everyone to the webinars today. Chiara from Julie's Bicycle is going to be presenting. And sort of the purpose of the webinars today is sort of partly to really focus on specific areas of the industry and how we can all be sort of more sustainability minded towards them. But also these webinars are forming part of a kind of a consultation with the broader industry about a draft voluntary declaration that Live Green has produced. So Chiara will certainly sort of run through more details about that later on. Really quickly, if anyone has a comment or question, please do put them into the chat, and we'll get to them as well. So without further ado, good morning, Chiara.
Hi, Greg. Good morning, and thank you for that introduction. And thank you so much to everyone who has tuned in and who is listening to us. We know that this is, for many of you, quite a difficult week, so it is really appreciated that you are sharing your time with us today. So as Greg says, this is the first actually of a series of these Live Green Sustainability webinars that we're pulling together. This one is focusing specifically on offices and office-based businesses, and we have more detailed ones to follow on touring, festivals, venues, and for artists and management. So we'll share the dates and times for those again at the end of this one. For those of you who haven't seen my face before, which many of you may have done, my name is Chiara. I work at Julie's Bicycle. Julie's Bicycle is a charity that was originally founded from within the UK music industry nearly 15 years ago now, to support the industry in taking action on climate change and other environmental issues. There was, I think, a recognition that this was something that was coming down the line, but also a bit of lack of knowledge and support of what the right thing was to do, and how to go about doing it. So that's really what we spent the past 10, 15 years working on, first with the music industry, but then also with the wider performing arts, looking at what are the environmental issues, what else do we need to know that we don't know at the moment, how can you take action, and how do we take this out of our own businesses as well into the wider world out there. So we do that through consultancy, through projects and programs that cover everything from venues, festivals, individual training, and more. And so we're really pleased that the sort of Live Green Working Group has asked us to hold these workshops for you. We've been part of the working group that has helped to shape the vision and the voluntary declaration. So this really is an opportunity for everyone to sort of understand a bit more about the thinking that's gone into it, what it's going to mean for different businesses, ask questions and provide feedback. So again, I'd just like to repeat Greg's prompt as well. Please do use the chat and the comments, share your thoughts, ask your questions. We are really, really keen to receive them and help you through this. So Greg, I think we can go to slides now. Brilliant, thank you. So this at the moment is the vision. It is a work in progress, but to read it out for you, this is not a rehearsal. We commit to a regenerative future, taking the lead on climate action and collaborating towards a sustainable society. We acknowledge responsibility for individual and collective actions to make ongoing absolute reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and reach net zero by 2030. We will work together with our stakeholders to inspire positive change in areas outside our direct control. So we will look at some of these words and what they mean in a bit more detail. And also, just to add, we have not been the only ones involved in pulling together this vision. It's been a brilliant working group, kind of pulling together some of the leading experts that have been working in this space and supporting the music industry to take sustainability action. So we all put our heads together to try and come up with something that would be inspiring and meaningful and sort of robust and rigorous as well. And again, sort of meet the needs of this brilliant community of so many different shapes and sizes and types of business. And this is all rooted really in the current moment that we're in history. So we're halfway to doubling the concentration of carbon in our atmosphere from so-called pre-industrial levels, mainly through burning what we call fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. And because those greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere regulate the planet's temperature, more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere basically means it gets hotter. It might not seem like much, but it is now hotter than it has been in the entire history of human civilization. So we've warmed up the planet through what we've done by about 1 degree Celsius. And climate change is more or less sort of irreversible on any timescales that matter to us. So once it's locked in, it's locked in. But what we can do is we can stop things from getting worse. And the easiest way to think about that is that the climate won't stop changing until we stop putting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So you can imagine the atmosphere as a bathtub where we've got all the faucets running, greenhouse gases are flowing in, much more so than any natural processes can remove. And so that means the bathtub or the atmosphere is quickly filling up. And really, we have kind of a budget of how much we can put into the atmosphere before we set off tipping points that make things infinitely worse and sort of risk destabilizing a lot of the really nice Goldilocks conditions that we've built our civilization in. So for better or for worse, whether we like it or not, the decisions that we make now are really going to set the course for the next millennium on this planet. This is just what we've been burdened with as a working generation that is here now and today. But we can also see that as a challenge to us in terms of we hold this incredible power to influence really the lives of the generations after us and also the lives of people who are alive today. What that means in practical terms is we have to both cut our own impact, especially living in the so-called global north, so countries like Europe and America that are responsible for more historical emissions and more emissions now. And we have to use our voice to push for change out there. The two things are very connected. By cutting your own impacts, you start learning more about what else is needed, also on a policy and government level. And also it lends integrity to your voice when you're out there pushing for change and calling for more action from others. This term net zero that you've probably seen thrown around a lot, basically we can pull that apart to mean we have to reduce our emissions and get to nearly zero, and then you net out the remaining emissions by removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So what we're putting in has to be equal to or less than what is being taken out. One really important thing to remember and understand about this idea of net zero is that we can't just net ourselves out of the current levels of emissions. We don't have the land to plant enough trees. We don't have the technology that can take enough carbon back out of the atmosphere. So the most important thing for all of us, especially over the next 10 years, is to reduce emissions so that basically we're buying ourselves more time as well, and focus on that. One thing that can be quite useful to understand is where these greenhouse gases that we're putting in the atmosphere actually come from. Sorry, there's quite a lot of text on these slides, and we will share them with you afterwards if you want to sort of go back to anything. But the main greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide. It's very long-lived. It's kind of permanent on timescales that matter to us, so a few hundred years. And it's really the majority of the emissions that we're putting in the atmosphere. The main source of it is when we burn so-called fossil fuels. That's coal, oil, and gas for energy, so for electricity, for heating, for transport and getting around. We also release carbon dioxide when we clear forest. It sort of comes out of the soil and it comes out of the organic matter. It comes out of peatlands when we destroy them. And some carbon dioxide is also created directly as part of industrial processes, like when we make cement. But by far, the main source is our burning of fossil fuels for energy. Another key greenhouse gas that you've probably heard about is methane. It's a fair bit stronger than carbon dioxide, so about 25 times stronger. By that we mean it causes more heating. but it doesn't stick around for as long. So it only sticks around in the atmosphere for about 12 years. That's important to understand because it has such a heating effect. It can still push us over certain tipping points that cause more warming, but it's not permanent in the same way that carbon dioxide is. So the main sources of methane are agriculture, so quite often laughed about cow burps and farts, but also things like rice fields where you have kind of plants and other organic matter decomposing. And then another really important source is the gas that comes out of landfills. So when we put plants, material, vegetable waste, everything else into landfill, as it decomposes, it creates methane. Other sources are so-called fugitive emissions. So that's escapes of methane from when we produce coal, gas, and oil, and distribute gas through our networks. Nitrous oxide is another greenhouse gas, a lot stronger than carbon dioxide, does hang around a bit, but we release it in smaller volumes than carbon dioxide. And the main source of nitrous oxide is how we manage our soil. So how much fertilizer we use and our agricultural practices. And the last sort of key greenhouse gas is F-gases. Some of them are super, super, super impactful in terms of heating. Some of them are very long-lived, some of them are very short-lived. We release them in quite small volumes. They're artificially made. A lot of them we made as replacements, actually, for products that were causing holes in the ozone layer, and it turns out that they're having negative impacts in other ways. So our main sources of F-gases are, they get used in things like refrigeration and air conditioning, and also in things like aerosols, solvents, cosmetics, pharma, fire retardants, which is why there's so many rules and regulations, for example, about how we manage our fridges and air conditioning. Everything that we do is useful to see and understand in the context of the big shifts that are happening around us. So we'll spend a few minutes going through sort of the UK's plans for net zero. The UK has a legally binding target to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Some people say that is not fast enough, considering that the UK is responsible for a lot of the historical emissions that are already hanging around in the atmosphere, and is a richer country and could be doing more. But at the moment, that's the legal target that we have. So what I'm going to take you through is some of the scenarios that have been pulled together by a thing called the UK Committee on Climate Change, which is a body that's been created by the Climate Change Act that sets our climate targets. And they pull together these scenarios and roadmaps to help inform government around policy and what needs to happen and by when. Again, some people say more ambitious pathways are needed, but this is a useful one to kind of have in the back of your head, because this is what is informing government policy at the moment. And so at the moment, electricity production is around 15% of the UK's emissions. That has dropped a lot over the last few years, mainly by getting coal out of the electricity grid in the UK, and shifting to gas and building up renewables. So over the next decade, we have to keep going with that process. We have to keep shifting away from oil, coal, and also gas, shift to renewable energy and other zero and low carbon energy forms. So the best sort of renewable energy that we should be putting our money in is offshore wind. The other thing that needs to happen with electricity is we have to build lots and lots more of it, because we want to move a whole bunch of stuff onto the electricity grid that at the moment we do by using diesel fuel and other fossil fuels in other contexts, which we'll go through in a minute. But for us, that's relevant because whatever we can do to help create more renewable energy generation helps contribute to those targets and helps keep us on track to that roadmap. So when we think about our buildings, buildings are about 17% of emissions in the UK today. The majority of that is the gas that we're burning in our buildings to heat them. Buildings are also responsible for around 2/3 of the electricity consumption that's sort of covered in the above category, the 15% emissions from electricity generation. So what that means for our buildings is we have to invest in energy efficiency. So we use less electricity, we use less gas and energy for heating. And crucially, one of the big questions that is coming towards us over the next few decades is how we move away from gas for heating. And that means either joining heat networks, district heat networks that are being built, installing air source or ground source heat pumps that use electricity to heat buildings. They usually take some investment as well into insulation so that they work. And there might, in the longer term, also be a shift from using, instead of having gas in our grid, to have some hydrogen in our grid. But that's one of the big decisions that government has to make over the next decade, really. What's important for us to understand, again, particularly in our office buildings, especially ones that we own, but also if we're renting them, is that one of the big changes that's coming is you don't want to have a gas boiler anymore at some point in the next 10 years or so. Road and surface transport is now the biggest source of UK greenhouse gas emissions. It's nearly a fourth of emissions. Most of that is our use of cars, but vans and so-called heavy goods vehicles also contribute a lot. And so there is a big thing that's happening there in terms of a shift to electric vehicles. So cars and vans that are powered by batteries instead of burning diesel or petrol. But the other thing that actually does need to happen is we have to reduce demand for car travel. So we have to reduce that, depending on the scenarios, by 7 to 16% in the next 10 years, which means some journeys that are currently being done by car either have to not happen at all, or we have to shift to walking, cycling, public transport, taking the train instead. And that sort of shift to reduce the overall distance that we travel by car has to keep going until 2050. So again, if you're thinking about your own initiatives and planning, that's something to keep in mind. Electric vehicles will get us to certain parts, but actually we also need to think about how we use cars and vans and trucks less. Industry is a little bit less relevant to offices. That's sort of what gets used in manufacturing and construction. It's about 12% emissions today. It is relevant for other parts of the live music industry because, for example, the diesel that we use in our generators falls under that category. But I don't want to dwell on it as part of today's session, other than to note that obviously shifting to using products longer, reusing products and materials, and sort of buying greener things can help support some of those shifts and reductions. Waste is around 6% of emissions today in the UK, and that's the emissions from waste processing. It's not actually the carbon that's gone into making the products we use that then end up in the trash. And so the main way to reduce that is by stopping putting biodegradable waste, so paper, card, food, garden waste, wood, into landfill, ideally within the next few years, and increasing recycling rates and reducing waste in the first place. Agriculture and land use, that's around 12% of emissions today. So big trends in there are planting more trees, restoring our peatland. A really key one is shifting to healthier diets, so eating less meat and dairy and reducing food waste. And the ultimate aim with a lot of these actions is that we want to free up some of the land that we need at the moment to grow food, to grow feed for animals, to host the animals that get eaten, so that we can use that land instead to grow more trees, potentially to grow biofuels, so that actually the land becomes a different tool in our toolbox to fight climate change. And the last one, which I imagine is a big issue for a lot of people on this call, is air travel. So that's around 7% of the UK's emissions today. And that doesn't include some of the non-carbon impacts that come from having airplanes fly really high in the atmosphere. And that's quite a tricky one because to meet our climate targets, air travel cannot keep growing. It has to either remain at a level or even reduce. So there are some plans about and thinking in terms of policy about how you reduce demand for air travel over time. When we think of that in the context of our businesses, quite often you hear the term carbon footprint. So in the simplest explanation is that a carbon footprint is really the measure of the climate change impact of a business, of an activity, of a product, or of a country, a venue, event, an office. And it sort of gets calculated by using standard metrics to convert, they're called carbon conversion factors, but to convert certain things into these measures of carbon dioxide. And there's a thing called carbon dioxide equivalent, which is a metric also that helps you pull all the different emissions of all the different greenhouse gases that we've spoken about into a single number. So for some things we know it's pretty straightforward to know what the carbon impact is. If you burn a liter of diesel here, if you burn it elsewhere in the world, that will usually create the same amount of carbon, more or less. So we know that, yeah, 1 liter of diesel is this many kilos of carbon dioxide. In other areas, we're a little bit more dependent on the specific context. So for example, the electricity that we use, the carbon footprint of that electricity depends on how it's been generated. And so the same music venue or the same building in different countries can actually have a very different carbon footprint depending on whether there's more coal or gas in the grid, or whether there's more renewable energy or hydropower or nuclear in the grid. And then in terms of carbon footprints of things like tomatoes, where you move away from that burning of fossil fuels, it becomes much more difficult to give one absolute number, because a tomato's carbon footprint is going to depend on how the land that it's grown on is managed, what kind of farm machinery has been used, how it's been processed, transported, how it's been packaged. So you still get estimates for things like tomatoes, but there is more estimating that is going on in giving you a carbon footprint of a tomato, basically. To try and address some of that uncertainty, there is a framework called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which was designed and created to kind of standardize how different businesses report their carbon footprint. It looks pretty scary when you first meet it, but again, it's just trying to place the responsibility for emissions to as close to the source of where many fossil fuels are burned. So it's divided into 3 scopes, the protocol. So scope 1 is emissions from things that you own or operate. So that's your gas boilers. If you own or control company cars, might be generators as well. Scope 2 is the emissions from the energy you buy that's generated elsewhere. So things like mainly your electricity, basically. And then scope 3 is actually the emissions from everything else. Your business travel, the goods and services you buy, transportation, distribution, waste processing, what your investments do, and things like audience travel. So that's sometimes called value chain emissions in technical greenhouse gas accounting speak. Another way to think about that, actually, if you're a music business or if you're any kind of business, is in terms of spheres of control. So you might be reporting your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, but where you can make a difference might look a little bit different to that. So in your immediate control are things like what you buy and how much, whether you travel for business or not, how you manage the energy in your spaces. What you influence might be how, for example, people travel, what your suppliers invest in, what your partners do. And then there are things that are outside your direct control, but that you might be able to campaign around or ask others to change or shift. So you don't directly control what public transport infrastructure is available, but you can get in touch with the public authority to make the case that you want more of it. So coming back to the vision that Live Green has pulled together, so we commit to a regenerative future, taking lead on climate action, collaborating towards a sustainable society. We acknowledge responsibility for individual and collective actions to make ongoing absolute reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, reach net zero by 2030. We will work together with our stakeholders to inspire positive change in areas outside our direct control. You see that little footnote at the bottom. At the moment, we're talking about scope 1, scope 2, and business travel in terms of greenhouse gas reporting and targets specifically. What this really means, this net zero by 2030, is for the next 10 years, our focus is on doing whatever we can to reduce emissions, helping others reduce theirs, and helping to change our industry And then also using our voice and our platforms to ask for change out there in society. Net zero by 2030 basically means having more or less halved emissions from where we are today, in line with the science. The net zero commitment means removing greenhouse gas emissions we can't avoid by investing in projects that sort of remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, and of course still helping to change our industry and the world, and keeping doing that beyond 2030. We keep reducing emissions, we keep removing greenhouse gas emissions we can't avoid. So you can divide that kind of into three buckets. It's how we run our businesses, events, venues, tours, how we role model green investments, technologies, actions, and behaviors in how we run our businesses and tours. It's how we support our audiences, artists, and others working with us and visiting us to do the right thing. And lastly, how we use platforms to call for and support change, that incredible power that live music has. So the voluntary declaration that comes with that vision, again, this is a work in progress, is we will work towards the following: work with Live Green to reduce our operational and business travel greenhouse gas emissions, set reduction targets in line with the Live Green vision, measure and report progress annually, develop a net zero roadmap and action plan, taking responsibility for actions in energy, waste, procurement, transport, food, and governance, understand and define emissions within our value chain, follow best practice to affect change in areas outside of our direct control, collaborate with suppliers and clients towards the Live Beyond Zero vision, ensure people undertake climate literacy education and have an ongoing commitment to knowledge sharing within the live music sector and beyond, talk to our stakeholders honestly about the impacts of our business on the environment and efforts we're making towards a regenerative future. So for an office-based business, pulling that voluntary commitment apart a little bit, measure and publicly report Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and emissions from business travel. So in an office, that means the information that you need is how much electricity and gas you're using in the office. You can usually get that off utility bills, or if you're in a shared or lease space, you might have to go off estimates based on your square meters of office space. If you own or operate vehicles, it means knowing how many liters of fuel they use or having a record of the mileage they've driven, that you can again estimate then your carbon footprint based on that mileage. And it means keeping a record of business travel for your team, especially for flights, the distance that you've flown, or as a minimum, the number of long haul or short haul flights that have been taken, and also what class they are, the number of hotel nights, keeping track of taxi and staff car mileage that gets reimbursed, and train travel. If you use a travel agent, they should actually be able to support that collection of information. So that's the commitment for an office-based business, and sharing those numbers on the company website and with Live. Setting a 2030 reduction target that covers as a minimum those Scope 1 and 2 emissions and business travel. That's in line with the Live vision and science-based target pathways. So you can use, there's a thing called the Science-Based Target Initiative that tries to help businesses outline targets and set them in line with the science. There's different categories for SMEs or bigger businesses. But the rule of thumb is roughly that we're looking at a 50% reduction every decade from now until 2050. So 50% reduction by 2030, more or less. Develop and follow a roadmap and action plan. So looking at your impacts in different areas and what you're going to do about them. Climate literacy and learning. So organizing training for staff or giving permission to staff to attend climate literacy trainings or workshops or be part of information exchange networks. A commitment to put climate on the agenda with your staff, with partners, audiences, suppliers, and being part of Live Green. So contributing to that information and knowledge sharing as a community, benefiting from the centralized support that's coming through Live Green, and then contributing to plans for the net part of the 2030 vision, how you're going to draw down greenhouse gas emissions from 2030. So this is an example. Different office carbon footprints do look different depending on the size of the office, how many employees you have, and how much travel is a part of your business. But for example, in this case, you can see that the majority of the carbon footprint of this office space is coming from the business travel that is flights. It happens to be one of the most energy intensive things that we do. So quite often it will show up as a big part of the carbon footprint. So this is a bit of a comparison of emissions from different modes of transport, as you can see, and that's per passenger per kilometer. So how you travel does make a really big difference, but the overall distance does as well. So another reason why flights tend to contribute so much to the carbon footprint of our business travel is because of the distances that we're covering in those airplanes. In terms of some highlights for what you might include in an office action plan, again, on the strategy and sort of governance side, is making someone responsible for overseeing commitments, someone who's responsible for monitoring and reporting data, for making sure stuff gets done, that targets get reached. That might be a sustainability manager or a green team or someone who's got it written into their job description in some way. Again, it is about creating that internal capacity for someone to feel like this is part of their job. Putting in place your action plan and environmental policy, so a statement of why this matters, what your impacts are, and a plan for how you're tackling them and what you want to achieve that you can also share with others you work with. Putting a public information page on your website that outlines those commitments and actions. And again, using utility bills and business travel records to begin building a picture of your carbon emissions. There is a thing called the Julie's Bicycle Creative Green Tools for Offices, which is a free carbon calculator that you can use. Or if you feel like you need additional support, there's loads of consultancies out there that can help. In terms of energy, a key action is switching to 100% renewable electricity for your office, or even generating your own, especially if you own the building. Encouraging staff, artists, and partners to do the same, especially now with so much home working. A lot more businesses are thinking about how they can also get their staff and encourage and support their staff to switch to renewable electricity tariffs in their homes. There's one business I've spoken to recently, for example, that take their staff out for lunch if they switch at home. Reducing energy use in the office, so better energy management, your standard switching off, but really also looking at temperature controls, investing in energy efficient lighting and equipment. If you own the building, thinking about installing a heat pump, especially if your gas boiler is coming up for replacement or needs fixing, and in connection with that, sort of looking at energy efficiency retrofits. In terms of business travel and commuting, again, thinking about international trips that might be avoided. We've all had, I think we've all been slightly zoomed out, but at the same time, I think what the experience of the past year has shown us is that there are definitely things, business trips that we've taken that we don't always need to take. If you do have to fly, trying to group meetings again so that you can reduce the number of trips that you're taking, and wherever possible, flying economy. So business class is nearly 3 times and first class nearly 4 times the impact of an economy seat, which largely has to do with how much space those seats take up on an airplane. Many businesses have started putting in place travel policies that say that any trip that can be done in under a certain number of hours will be done by train. So you just make it policy, people don't even have to think about it. And of course, where staff are commuting, helping them commute better through things like cycle to work schemes, salary sacrifice, public transport, cards, safe bicycle lockups, allowing more flexible working so they might not have to commute as much in the first place. In terms of food, helping support some of those shifts to healthier diets. So if you're running an event, for example, choosing to go meat and fish free for your event catering, minimizing single-use plastics for that event catering, and introducing things like meat-free Mondays in the office, or if you actually have an on-site staff cafeteria, making sure vegetarian and vegan options are either available or going entirely meat and fish free in that cafeteria. For procurement and sort of other areas, a big one to look at is divesting your pension fund from fossil fuels. So for a lot of us, our pensions are actually invested in new fossil fuel capacity, and we don't always know that that's happening. So speak to your pension provider about what your pension is being invested in, and if they can't give you a straightforward answer, consider switching to an ethical pension fund that promises not to invest in fossil fuels. Also ask your bank about their kind of ethical lending and investment policies. If you can switch business banking to a more ethical bank, there will be other considerations there in terms of what's currently on the market. Do put in place a policy to either offset impacts or also make equivalent donations or pledge a percentage of annual income or profit to climate justice causes, climate investments, things that are helping us really, again, reduce our emissions over the next 10 years. And think about having minimum environmental standards for products that you buy a lot of in an office. Again, that might be something like post-consumer recycled paper. And of course, consider who you partner with and what those partnerships say about your values and where you're going. And speak to everyone that you can. So again, these are some office-focused actions. There's a lot else to unpack depending on what you are doing in that office. So again, we'll come back to more detail on venues, festivals, touring, artists and management in some of the future Live Green webinars. The climate strategy hierarchy is useful to think about. So starting off by measuring and understanding, track how you're doing, avoiding emissions by doing things differently, reducing emissions by increasing efficiency, replacing, for example, high carbon energy sources with low carbon energy sources, and lastly, putting a cost on the emissions that can't be eliminated, but only doing that as a last resort and only if you're confident that you're also reducing your carbon footprint in other ways. A few sort of words of advice gained from many years working with people on these issues. Do your research, but don't let perfect be the enemy of action. This is a process and a journey. It's about shifting really the way that we think about our work and our working practices. Be honest, transparent, open and accountable, especially within the Live Green community. Share learning and tell the whole story. We don't have all the answers. We are in part taking a leap of faith and sort of figuring out what this means for our businesses and the way that we do things. And always ask follow-up questions to try and identify when people are greenwashing. So if you get claims like environmentally friendly, or biodegradable or recyclable, always ask that question, how so? Under what conditions does it biodegrade? Is it commonly recycled? If someone's saying this is better for the environment, better than what? What exactly are you trying to say with this statement? And we think of all this work in a cycle. So commitment, making that decision that you are going to go with this, that you are going to take that journey, that you're going to take action. Understanding, so understand where your impacts are, what you can do about them, building the understanding and knowledge and skills within your staff team. Improvement, so taking action, and never forgetting about that communication part and making visible what you're doing, bringing in everyone that you work with and having a conversation about how you might work together and support each other. Again, cut our impacts and push for change, seeing those two things as interrelated and connected. They will reinforce each other if you make that commitment. And if you want to look at some free resources, the Creative Green tools, again, are free carbon calculators. As long as you have some information like your utility bills to hand, you can actually start getting a carbon footprint of your business's current impacts. And there's lots of free practical guides and resources as well, looking at everything from business travel to greening the office that you can find on the Julie's Bicycle website. Just before we finish, I thought I'd share a few examples of some of my favorite kind of office-based actions. This is not from the live music community, but it is part of the music community. So Ninja Tune, the record label, they have done a huge amount on this over the last few years. So I'll highlight some of the highlights are that they are installing an air source heat pump in their office. That's scheduled to happen this year. So getting rid of the gas heating in their office. They are with a renewable electricity supplier for their office. So at the moment, that's Good Energy. And they've also already installed 18 solar panels on the roof of their London office and are just putting 6 more on there at the moment. They are, of course, looking a lot at their supply chain in terms of the vinyl and CD manufacture and sort of how they engage with the supply chain, helping to drive conversations forward in their industry. They've started the AIM Climate Action Group and also the Impala Sustainability Task Force, which looks at these things on a European level for independent labels. In-house, one of my favorite things that they do is that they actually subsidize train travel for staff holidays, so that they help their staff go on holiday without flying. So they have sort of I think it's a certain amount of money that you can apply to as a staff member to take the train instead of flying for your holiday trip. They've shifted their default employee pension scheme to one that doesn't invest in fossil fuels, and are also working and asking their banking suppliers about their policies and practices. And they're supporting time and resources into campaigning, both directly participating in conversations, but also co-founding movements like Music Declares Emergency and giving donations to organizations like Extinction Rebellion, like the Rainforest Trust, and other climate justice and environmental initiatives. And this is, again, from slightly outside live music, but this is Home, which is an arts centre up in Manchester. They do a lot more in terms of the venue, but I just wanted to run through some of the things that they do for their staff. So all their staff receive carbon literacy training, a workshop basically explaining climate change impacts and what they can do about it within 6 months of starting at the organisation. And they actually now offer training as well to other organizations and to their suppliers to kind of help shift the conversation. They have a regular environmental column in their weekly team brief that sort of shares environmental news and opportunities and things that people can do. They run staff activities like swap shops, plant-based staff lunches, staff cinema screenings of environmentally themed films and documentaries, again, to kind of create an atmosphere of this is something that matters to us, and also sort of build social connections and use the opportunity of staff activities in that way. They have a green news notice board in their green room that also encourages visiting creatives and volunteers to get involved. This might be really relevant, you know, if you are a business that works with a lot of freelancers or part-time people that come in and go out, again, is sort of thinking about how you're going to engage them as well and bring them into your journey. They work with Transport for Greater Manchester to survey staff travel and sort of understand where people are traveling from and how. And also every staff member actually gets a personalized travel pack to support them to make greener choices, especially around public transport. They have bike pool schemes. They do bicycle maintenance and training workshops and lockers and showers on site. They do a sustainable procurement survey for all their current and potential suppliers, again, to understand a bit sort of what are our main suppliers doing at the moment, what are they thinking of doing, what can they already offer, and where do we need to push a bit more. And they have their environmental and sustainability action plan is sort of embedded as well in their overall key performance indicators. So they've really built it into the organizational DNA and strategy at every level. Lastly, again, some of this has been quite technical, but whenever we're sort of feeling down a little bit, I think one really good way to think about our environmental action is reframing it. So this really isn't just about how we reduce our environmental impact, but actually it is also about how we bring our creativity to fighting climate change, to supporting social justice, to creating livable cities and places, to restoring nature. So there is some really, really rich stories in action here for everyone. And also lots of help and community across lots of different areas. If you're interested in campaigning and speaking out, Music Declares Emergency is where you go. If you're interested in industry initiatives to put a price on your emissions, Equilibrium and Earth Percent are working on that. The Tour Production Group, Sustainability and Production Alliance, working on touring, lots of event networks and support. And again, lots of individual consultancies as well if you need more help. That can help with everything from carbon footprinting and certification. That includes people like us, but it also includes people like EcoDisco, Hope Solutions, Greener Festival, Chris Johnson. And lastly, again, so we focused on offices for this first one, but we have also got future ones on touring, festivals, venues, artists and management. Do put them in your diary, or you can re-watch them and watch them back. And now we have lots of time for questions, which I'll try and catch up on now. But yeah, if you have any questions that have come up, please, please, please put them in the chat in the comments, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. So Kai has asked, given the huge reduction in office-based working that is likely to continue, does anyone foresee an increase in shared office spaces being used by different non-competing players in the industry? I think it's a really good question. It's one that we're definitely thinking about at Julie's Bicycle, because we're not back in the office yet. We scaled down our office space. We probably won't ever need space for everyone again. But I think some of the office market is probably running to catch up a bit. If anyone has any thoughts on that that they would like to share, please do so. But we're definitely in that boat of thinking about how we manage our space. Any other questions? There really is no such thing as a stupid question on this. We've just gone through a lot of content, some of which has been quite technical. So I'm always really happy. If you have any questions that you want to follow up with afterwards as well, if you don't feel that comfortable putting them in the chat, you can always send me an email too. Stunned everyone into silence. If anyone, most events sit behind the mega events. Who are the biggest contributor? How do we influence these? I'm going to try, there's a question. So most events sit behind the mega events. Who are the biggest contributor? How do we influence these? I'm going to try pull apart what I think that question is asking in terms of there are, yes, very big events that have significant impacts. So again, we'll be looking at festivals on the 24th of June. But in terms of coming back to this idea of influence, again, where you can most effectively influence is going to depend on how big your business is, what your spending power is in the industry, and what your connections are. But I think it is always useful to think through, again, where you think your levers of change are, and sort of the closest people to you that you can have a conversation with, to tell them actually that this is something that you care about and that you would like to see more action. Because especially in an industry like live music, in a community like live music, the conversations that I always hear are around, well, we would like to do this, but we don't really have any power to do anything, unless the venues or festivals take action. You hear other people say, well, we would like to do this, but we can't really do anything unless the artists ask for it. And you sort of end up in this weird conundrum where no one feels able to take the first step because they're all waiting for someone else to do so. So although it can be quite difficult, I do encourage you to think about those moments where you can be the first person to make that step, even if it's just opening up the conversation by asking a question and saying, hey, what are you doing on sustainability? Because this is something I'm really worried about. And if you can point me to some information, then that would be great. And again, it sort of helps reinforce that commitment through the voluntary Live Green commitment. But if every live music business in the UK sort of had a page on their website that showed, these are the actions that we're taking, these are the commitments that we're making, then that's already a massive step forward, and just making visible that we're not alone in this, which it can sometimes feel like we are. So thank you for that question. It's a really good one. But thinking about starting to improve sustainability in the office, where's the one best place to start? I think there are two places. So one is that information and data. So really getting a handle on how your office is powered, how much electricity it's using, a little bit of information again, is it on gas heating? Are we already in an office space that's shifted away from gas, so that you get an idea of what your priorities are for taking action? But the other really important place to start is your team and the people who are in the office every day. So one of the things we do a lot with the organizations we work with is a staff survey that just asks about some really practical questions around how are you traveling to work, but also some more interesting questions around, what are the things that you're concerned about? What are any ideas that you might have around how we might improve sustainability, both in the office and our business? Because ultimately, especially if you're in a bigger organization, everyone will have the expertise of their specific area and responsibilities. So if you can unlock that and sort of get everyone engaged and thinking about this in their own work, then you're kind of already halfway there in terms of making change happen. So I would say those two things. One is you're measuring and sort of getting information on the hard impacts of your office, and the second one is people. Even just pulling together, a meeting, an informal meeting, once maybe we're allowed to be back in the office or on Zoom before we are, to say, hey, this is a topic we'd like to talk about. Who might be interested in joining a green team or pushing this further, so that you can find your allies, basically. Any other questions? If there are no more questions, I think we will wrap it up there. So thank you again so much for everyone who has tuned in. So we'll be back on the 22nd of June for touring, the 24th of June for festivals, the 29th of June for venues, the 30th of June for artists and management. If there is something that comes to mind later on, or a burning question that you have, please, you can email me, chiara@juliesbicycle.com, or you can probably submit that question directly to Live. And again, this is all part of that overall consultation towards that Live vision and that voluntary declaration, to make sure we take action as a collective community, and to make sure that the vision sort of meets the needs actually of everyone who's working in the industry. Thank you so much for your time, and hope you have a positive rest of a difficult week.